Good evening, everyone. My name is Sophia, and this story took place a few years ago when I attended the funeral of my estranged mother. She and I had a complicated relationship for most of my life, and though I harbored a mix of emotions about her passing, nothing prepared me for what I would experience during those days. My mother was a strong-willed and harsh woman. Though she never physically harmed me or my sister, her words often cut deeper than any wound. Over time, her personality grew even more distant as she became involved with a group of people who practiced strange rituals and followed esoteric beliefs. The energy in her house grew dark, unexplained occurrences, shadows moving, and odd noises became a regular part of life. These events eventually drove me and my family to move far away. When my mother passed, I received the call from my sister. "She's gone," she said, her voice shaking. We met at the funeral home to make arrangements. The director informed us that our mother had been found on her living room couch, deceased for at least 2 days before being discovered by a neighbor. The official cause of death was a massive heart attack. I stayed at the funeral home late, into the evening, filling out paperwork, while my sister left to care for her newborn baby. Sitting alone in the dimly lit reception area, I began to feel uneasy. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. Then I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, called my name. "Sophia," it said, drawing out each syllable. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, listening intently. A few seconds later, the voice came again. "Sophia, I'm here." I stood up, trembling, and walked toward the hallway from where the voice seemed to originate. The long corridor was lined with doors, each leading to a room containing either coffins or preparation equipment. At the very end was a door marked, "Authorized personnel only." The voice came again, this time louder, clearer, from behind that very door. Gathering my courage, I opened it. The room was cold, dimly lit, and dominated by a metal table in the center. Lying on that table, draped in a white sheet, was my mother's body. Her eyes were closed and her face appeared unnervingly peaceful. As I stepped closer, my phone's flashlight illuminating the room, I heard the faint sound of movement. The air grew colder, and then I saw it. Her fingers twitched. My rational mind told me it was just post-mortem reflexes. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, her eyes snapped open. She stared directly at me, her gaze unblinking. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then her mouth opened, and though no sound came out, it was clear. She was trying to say something. Overwhelmed with fear, I fled the room and didn't stop running until I reached the reception area. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Instead, I hurriedly completed the paperwork and left for the night. When I returned for the funeral the next morning, I found solace in the presence of others. My husband and children stayed close, but the feeling of dread lingered. As the service began, I noticed something strange. My young daughter, just 6 years old, stood by the casket talking softly, as if having a conversation. I approached her, worried, and asked, "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" She looked up at me, her innocent eyes wide, and said, "Grandma told me she's sorry." My breath caught in my throat. "What did she say exactly?" I asked. My daughter's voice was quiet but certain. "She said she didn't mean to hurt you and Auntie. She's sorry for everything." Tears welled up in my eyes. My mother had never apologized in life. But now, through my daughter, she was finally seeking forgiveness. That moment brought a strange mix of peace and unease. I turned back to the casket, placed my hand gently over hers, and whispered, "I forgive you." From that point on, the oppressive weight I had felt since her passing began to lift. I like to believe that somehow she found the closure she needed to move on. Thank you for listening to my story. May we all find peace. Virgin 2. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrea. And this story takes us back to my university days. I was studying at a medical school in the United States, known for its rigorous health sciences programs, including medicine, nursing, and psychology. Naturally, the campus featured an anatomy lab, where skeletal models, preserved organs, and even whole cadavers were kept for educational purposes. This event happened during my 4th semester. My friend and I had to submit a project to one of our professors. It was late, around 10 p.m., and the campus was nearly deserted, a time when students were rarely around unless for special circumstances. After searching for our professor all over the main building, a lab technician informed us that he was in the anatomy lab, inspecting recently delivered specimens. Without hesitation, we made our way to the lab. Having been there numerous times for our studies, the eerie atmosphere didn't bother us much. The lab resembled the kind you see in horror movies. Cold, sterile, with rows of stainless steel tables and lockers containing anatomical specimens. As we entered, the bright fluorescent lights flickered momentarily, adding to the unsettling ambiance. My friend decided to look for the professor, leaving me behind in the lab to wait in case he returned. I found a chair and sat down, attempting to distract myself. That's when I noticed a faint glow coming from one of the refrigeration units used to store cadavers. The unit had a small rectangular window, and behind it a dim light was on. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as I glanced back, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow passed swiftly behind the frost. At first, I thought it was my imagination, so I dismissed it, but then it happened again and again. Soon, I saw not just one shadow, but several moving in different directions, crossing paths as if people were walking back and forth inside the refrigeration unit. My curiosity piqued, though unease crept in as well. Why would anyone be inside the storage unit? It was kept at freezing temperatures, unbearable for anyone without proper insulation. Moments later, the door to the unit began to rattle. It was subtle at first, then increasingly aggressive, as though someone trapped inside was trying to get out. I rushed toward the unit, thinking someone might genuinely need help, but when I tried the handle, I found it securely locked from the outside, just as it should be during off hours. That realization sent chills down my spine. Panic set in, but I decided to fetch the campus security guard. He had keys to every room and storage area. When I explained the situation, the guard looked skeptical, but accompanied me back to the lab. To my surprise, when we returned, my professor and my friend were there, casually talking. They seemed completely unaware of what I had witnessed. The guard unlocked the refrigeration unit at my insistence, and we all peered inside. To my horror and confusion, the unit was empty except for 3 hanging cadavers. Their cold, lifeless forms swung slightly, as if disturbed moments before. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the professor interrupted, brushing it off with a strained smile. He quickly changed the topic, collected the papers we brought, and ushered us out of the lab. Months later, after the professor no longer taught my classes, I worked up the courage to ask him about that night. His response chilled me to the bone. He admitted that the anatomy lab had a long history of unexplained occurrences. Shadows, voices, and even soft cries were frequently reported by staff and students who stayed late. The lab had an unofficial rule: no one should be there past 10 p.m., as it was believed that restless spirits frequented the area, drawn to the preserved bodies. After that revelation, I made it a point never to linger near that building again. Hello everyone, my name is Louis, and this is a chilling story from my time working in a morgue in the United States. However, before sharing my own experience, I need to recount a tale that circulated widely among my colleagues, a story that later evolved into something of a legend. Years ago, the morgue where I worked was much smaller. Back then, a coroner worked there, someone whom the public viewed as polite and professional. He seemed like an ordinary, likable man. However, few knew the horrifying truth about what he did when he was alone. This coroner harbored a dark and depraved secret. During the night shifts, he would desecrate the corpses brought to the morgue. His actions were so vile and unspeakable that I still struggle to put them into words. He committed these atrocities for years before his deeds were uncovered. Once the truth came out, he was immediately fired and barred from ever working in any related field again. For a while, it seemed like the nightmare had ended, but soon after his dismissal, rumors began to swirl. Some claimed he was sneaking back into the morgue at night, either with the help of security staff or through his knowledge of the building's layout. Others said he was seen wandering the area, unable to resist the compulsion that had ruined his career. The story reached its horrifying climax one night when the coroner's body was discovered in the morgue. He was found in one of the storage rooms for corpses, and the state of his body defied explanation. His limbs were twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, as if a powerful force had crushed him like a paper doll. Witnesses said that when his body was moved, the sound of his bones cracking echoed through the hallways. After his death, the morgue shut down for several months before reopening. When I started working there, the legend of the perverse coroner was already deeply entrenched. Some long-time employees whispered warnings to the new hires: avoid the storage rooms at night and always keep a flashlight handy. These precautions seemed excessive to me at first, but after a few months on the job, I learned the hard way that their fears weren't unfounded. One stormy night, I was the only one working late. The rain poured heavily, and lightning illuminated the hallways intermittently. Suddenly the power went out, plunging the building into complete darkness. Although the morgue had an emergency generator, it hadn't kicked in yet. I called out for the security guard on duty, but he didn't respond. As I sat in the dark deciding my next move, I heard something unusual. A faint crackling sound. It was faint at first, but grew louder and more deliberate. The sound resembled the noise of bones being snapped or ground together. It was coming from down the hallway, and it was getting closer. At this point, I remembered the flashlights kept in a supply room. Using my memory of the building's layout, I felt my way down the corridor toward the storage room where the lights were kept. But the crackling sound followed me, growing louder and closer with every step. Whatever it was, it seemed to move with an unnerving rhythm, as if dragging itself along the floor. I finally reached the supply room and fumbled for a flashlight. When I switched it on and turned around, the sound abruptly stopped. I shone the beam down the hallway but saw nothing. However, the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself I was imagining things and returned to my workstation. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It wasn't until the next morning that I discovered something that sent chills down my spine. On the floor near the storage room, I found muddy footprints and deep scratches on the wall, as if something or someone had clawed its way toward me during the blackout. The story of the coroner came flooding back, and for the first time, I truly understood the warnings of my colleagues. From that day on, I never worked late shifts without keeping every light in the building on, and I always carried a flashlight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harold, and a few years ago I worked as a janitor at a funeral home in the United States. It wasn't an easy job to adjust to, as I was constantly surrounded by grief-stricken families and the eerie presence of the deceased. The atmosphere was heavy, and it took a toll on my mental health. One night, we received the body of a little girl just 5 years old. She had tragically passed away due to a sudden illness. I was tasked, along with another employee, to carry her small white casket into the preparation room. Seeing such a small coffin broke my heart, especially because I had a young daughter of my own. I tried not to let the sadness affect me too much, as staying detached was essential for the job. Later that evening, the staff left one by one until it was just me and the embalmer, who was still working on the child's body. It was nearing midnight, and I was cleaning the bathrooms when I heard soft footsteps entering. Assuming it was the embalmer, I called out to let them know I was cleaning, but there was no response. I looked under the stalls and saw a pair of small feet wearing shiny black shoes and frilly white socks. Thinking it might be someone's child who had wandered in, I stepped outside to check. But the embalmer was the only other person in the building. Confused, I told her about the child in the bathroom, but she assured me no one else was there. Her face turned pale when I described what I saw, and she suggested we check together. When we reached the bathroom, we found it completely empty. The small feet I had seen were gone, and every stall was vacant. The embalmer looked at me with concern, but returned to her work, asking me to call her if anything else happened. I tried to shake off the incident, convincing myself I was just seeing things due to exhaustion. As I continued my cleaning duties, I heard soft crying. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from the preparation room, where the little girl's body was being prepared for the next day's viewing. With a heavy heart and shaky hands, I walked toward the door and peered inside. The embalmer was gone. She must have left for the night, but the small casket was there, sealed shut. The crying stopped abruptly as I stepped inside. The room fell into an unnatural silence. I stared at the casket, feeling an unshakable presence. Summoning all my courage, I placed a hand on the lid and whispered a prayer for the child. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint giggle behind me. My blood ran cold as I spun around, but nothing had changed. The casket remained closed, and the room was empty. I left the room quickly, grabbed my things, and locked up for the night. As I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the image of those little shoes or the sound of that haunting giggle. The next day, the viewing was held. I stayed in the background, observing the grieving family as they gathered around the casket. The little girl's mother was inconsolable, whispering through tears that her daughter had always been afraid of being alone at night. She kept saying over and over, she doesn't want to be left in the dark. Hearing this broke me. I finally understood the child's presence from the previous night. She was scared, just as her mother said. She didn't want to be left alone in that dark mortuary. The realization filled me with sadness and guilt. I spoke with my wife that evening and told her everything. She encouraged me to leave the job as the emotional toll was becoming unbearable. A week later, I resigned and found work elsewhere. However, the memory of that little girl, her shiny shoes, her giggle and her soft cries, has stayed with me ever since. And greetings to all. My name is Charles, and this is a story from when I worked at a funeral home in the United States. I was responsible for preparing bodies for viewings, a solemn and meticulous task. It was work that demanded respect and care, as we were tasked with providing families their final moments of closure. One particular Friday night, I was left alone at the funeral home. My boss had gone out to handle some personal matters, leaving me in charge of receiving a body scheduled to arrive later that evening. The deceased was a man who had tragically passed away in a severe car accident. His funeral was set for the next day. The silence in the funeral home was oppressive, but I tried to focus on the task at hand. Around 9 p.m., the funeral transport arrived, and I went to the garage to assist in unloading the casket. It was a simple wooden coffin, unadorned, but sturdy, reflecting the modest means of the family. However, as we placed it on the preparation table, I noticed something unusual. The coffin was secured with a padlock. At first, I assumed this was some special request from the family, perhaps for added security. I asked the transport workers if they had a key, but they didn't. They claimed it had arrived that way, locked and without instructions. This struck me as odd, but I didn't want to dwell on it. I decided to call my boss for guidance. When I explained the situation to him, he sounded puzzled. He said he hadn't been informed about the lock and advised me to wait until morning when he could clarify the matter with the hospital or the family. He stressed that I should not tamper with the coffin under any circumstances. I agreed and hung up. But as the minutes ticked by, my curiosity began to gnaw at me. Why was the coffin locked? What were they trying to hide? The unanswered questions fueled an urge to find out, even though I knew it was against protocol. After some hesitation, I gave in. I searched the room for something that could break the padlock and found a heavy-duty pair of shears. With trembling hands, I began working on the lock. It took considerable effort, but after a few tense moments, the lock snapped open with a sharp, metallic crack. I stared at the coffin for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding. Slowly, I lifted the lid, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness of the room. What I found inside left me frozen in place. The coffin was empty. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I leaned closer, scanning every inch of the wooden interior, but there was no doubt the coffin contained nothing. My heart raced as I tried to comprehend what was happening. Had there been a mistake, or was something far stranger at play? Before I could process the bizarre discovery, I heard a soft knock behind me. The sound was faint, but deliberate. Turning around, I saw the door to the preparation room slowly creaking. Open, a chill ran down my spine as I stared at the doorway, half expecting someone or something to enter. A figure appeared, and I immediately recognized it. It was the man whose body should have been in the coffin. He stood tall, dressed, in the same suit his family had chosen for him to be buried in. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, and he slowly raised a hand, pointing to the coffin behind me. His voice, soft and otherworldly, broke the silence. "You shouldn't have opened it. Without another word, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the hallway. The air in the room grew heavy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I slammed the coffin shut, replaced the lock as best as I could, and fled the funeral home, leaving all the lights on behind me. The next morning I called my boss and resigned, unable to face the thought of returning to that place. To this day, I don't know what I saw or why that coffin was empty, but I've learned one thing: some mysteries are better left unsolved.